In this week's video, I'm going to be trimming a simple, angular stoneware vase with the simple caveat that in no way, shape or form is this pot perfectly centered, and you'll see just what I mean once it's tap centered into the middle so it spins on its central axis. And there you go. The rim feels centered, but the rest of the pot isn't, and so, in the next few minutes, I'll show you how I trim pots to correct any irregularities like this, as it's really quite remarkable just how much you can salvage something. And if I hold my finger still, you can see just how big the discrepancies are in certain places. Even the rim is undulating up and down slightly. And so when I try and fix pots like this, I generally center the rim rather than the base portion, as 90% of thrown pots will just be slightly thicker in the base, which means there's just a bit more clay to work with. To begin, I hold my trimming tool really steadily so it only carves away from the part of the wall that's undulating out the most. This might take a few passes, but you can see already in the section I've trimmed just how much less that part of the wall wobbles. Now if you've thrown a pot that's incredibly thin, there's only so much you can do to save a pot that's dried unevenly and then leaned over to one side, which is what I think happened to this vessel. One thing these tungsten carbide tools do, especially when used on a slightly grogged stoneware clay, is leave a surface like this. We call this chattering, and it can be done purposefully to create decorative, repetitive surfaces. I almost even sometimes quite like it, especially when all the lines stack up vertically, and it gives the impression almost as if the pot's been woven. But the glazes I use don't sit particularly nicely over it. So during this process of removing mass and correcting the wobble there is in the walls, I don't mind if there's some chattering, but I will always tidy it up. And I do that by scraping over the surface with a flat metal kidney, like this. Or I even use a relatively blunt turning tool, as it leaves a more burnished, smooth surface. With the lowest plane trimmed, I'll move up to the next. And once again I'm doing the exact same thing, where I let the tool trim off more from one side than the other, allowing that excess undulating clay to move into the straight line I'm trying to carve with the tool. And even with just one pass here, it's more or less completely corrected, although it still certainly needs to be refined some more. My left hand is positioned inside the pot, and I usually press my fingertips opposite the area I'm trimming. That way I can feel just how thick the cross section is as I'm working. But my aim at this point is to trim a form that has very sharp angles and exceedingly straight lines, as ultimately the glazes I use tend to soften whichever shape they're coated over. The glaze is applied evenly over the entire pot, yet as it melts it will flow down the form, creating slight curves where it pools, thinning in one spot and thickening in another. So I tend to trim to make this work for me, and it's why, for instance, I want that line around the waist to be so sharp, as if it was softened at this point. Once the pot has been glazed and fired, it'll be even softer. This is the more blunt turning tool I was speaking of. It still removes clay, but it leaves a much more burnished surface, which makes it quite good for finishing, so in many cases I just do a final go-over with it. It's not so much about removing clay at this point, rather it's just making sure the shape is exactly how I want it. Before I get started on the base of this pot, I need to first trim the rim, as if you remember, it was undulating up and down quite a lot, and it's also just a tad too thick for my liking, so I'll trim it, making the inside form flow out to a sharper point around the rim. Florian, why didn't you do this all at the throwing stage? I hear some of you ask. And that's a good question. As a potter, I personally prefer the process of refinement, at the trimming stage especially, as there's a certain level of finesse I can achieve which just isn't possible when throwing. More than anything, I just really like the process. It's clean, I have to be careful, and I get to use the tools I really love. In my eye, I don't think it really matters which technique or path you take, as long as the end product is good. What makes you content as a craftsperson and which objects that you create make you happy are probably the two most important things. Anyway, enough philosophizing. Once the surfaces have been trimmed and scraped clean, this part of the process is almost complete, and take a note of how it looks now versus the pot I started with. And you can so clearly see just how much more centered the entire pot is. The next part of this process is trimming the base of the pot. As with so much care and attention going to the rest of the vessel, it's the one area that I feel cannot be forgotten. So I separate the pot from the wheel with a knife, clean the metal with a rubber kidney, and then carefully position the pot upside down, delicately, on the rim. And as the walls of the pot are really very thin at this point, I tap center it into the middle very gently, as tapping it too hard could very easily damage the wall. Once secured in place, I place a spinner on top, which is also centered, and you can see by comparing how stationary the spinner is compared to the walls of the pot that a bit more clay needs to be trimmed away from the base to make it perfectly true. I hold this tool and I push down firmly through it, and this just helps to keep the vase pinned down in place as I work, as really there isn't much clay holding it around the rim. And once again, as I'm trimming, I'm tensing my right hand and keeping it as sturdy as it can possibly be as it moves up the wall of the pot, and I try my hardest to not let the turning tool's blade be influenced by the clay's wavering movement beneath it, as if I do that, any undulation there is in the wall simply gets worse. But really, there is only so far you need take this. Any undulations or wobbles in a pot are exaggerated as it's spinning around quickly on the wheel. Your eye can't help but see them, but as soon as the wheel stops, you no longer focus on them. So yes, I don't mind if there is a slight unevenness sometimes in my work, because I'll probably be the only person to ever fixate on it. But I suppose by watching these videos, you'll see the things I see, and I hope, to some degree, those things are insightful. Finally, it's the very bottom of the pot's turn to be trimmed. I've pushed down firmly on it and felt no movement whatsoever, which means there's probably a bit of clay in the bottom that I can remove, thus making the vase just that bit lighter. I trim some away, and then I check, and then I trim more, and I'll keep doing this until I can feel just the tiniest amount of give in the bottom of the pot. I don't want it to deform inwards with the lightest touch, as that simply means the base of the pot is way too thin, but I just want to feel as if there's a bounce, instead of it simply feeling very solid. So I shave away layer by layer, and in this case I was surprised by just how much clay I could remove. This pot obviously wasn't thrown very well, yet. With pots that come to a narrow base, there is sort of a limit to how thin you can throw the walls when they then angle outwards so much, especially with a form that's so angular. Anyhow, once the base has been trimmed, I then burnish over it to smooth it to a glassy finish, which you can almost see as the surface reflects my fingertips when they're placed next to it. And finally, I can push my maker's mark into the base. And occasionally, if I feel like the edges of this stamp are a bit messy, I'll just burnish over it really lightly, which seems to crisp them up nicely. Then when I removed the pot, I felt like there was just a fraction more clay left in the base that I could turn away, so I just popped it back upside down and in a few passes trimmed about 2 or 3 millimeters away from the outside wall. I then had to burnish the base again as my spinner tool had marked it, and then upon flipping it upside down again, I saw that I wasn't particularly happy with the rim. So I gingerly placed it onto its base and just compressed over the rim with a rubber kidney, and this of course meant that I then had to go back and burnish the base one last time, as by this point the clay on the base of the pot is really quite damp, so it was marked when I placed it back onto the metal. But here they are, 3 similar shapes, all of which I've now glazed and fired. I didn't film those processes in their entirety, so here's a quick recap. First, the pots are bisque fired to 1000 degrees Celsius. This makes the clay far harder, which means they can now be picked up by their rims and held with tongs, and submerged into glaze, and for the one you saw me trimming, I wanted to glaze it white. The pot is then packed into my gas kiln, which is a Rohde KG340, which is fueled with natural gas, and reduction fired over a 9-hour period to about 1290 degrees Celsius. 36 hours later, once the kiln has completely cooled down, I struggle to open the door and then finally get to glimpse the pots I've been working on for months. A totally enthralling, but often quite terrifying moment. And, with any luck, the vase should hopefully now be coated in glass and without any flaws. And from when you saw it at leather hard to this point, it has shrunk considerably, about 12% from beginning to end. It's a lovely simple piece, coated in a uniform layer of white feldspathic crackle glaze, and it has a completely arbitrary iron blossom right inside, which was a piece of iron pulled out through the reduction process. And here's the finished base, which was very slightly sanded just to remove any sharp specks of sand that could otherwise scratch or damage any surfaces placed upon. And here's just a simple close-up of the glaze. It's very slightly tinged yellow, but really, as these pots are so glassy, they change colour tremendously depending on what light they're displayed in, which is why I try to always take my photographs in natural light, as I think it's what makes my pots look best. Anyway, that's all for this week. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.